Next from Springfield, former State Senator Mark Rhoads gives a presentation on influential Illinoisans of the past and their contributions to Illinois' and America's culture. This runs about 1 hour.
The panel that we're about to present is called the Diaspora of Illinoisans. Here we go. What we want to point out is that not all of Illinois history takes place within the borders of Illinois any more than all of American history takes place within the borders of the United States. We have people who, I have a very liberal definition of what constitutes an Illinoisan. Obviously, if a person was born here, raised here, went to high school and college here, they are definitely Illinoisans. And if they came from another state but spent a significant amount of time here at Northwestern University, at Second City, at any number of other places, we think they qualify as an Illinoisan. And what we're trying to do is set the stage for the celebration of the bicentennial in 2018. We are your panel. This is Terry Campo to my right. Raise your hand, Terry. Terry is a native of Springfield. He is currently the president of the Illinois State Society of Washington, D.C. In the middle is Tom Dreesen, an actor from originally from Blue Island, Illinois. Tom couldn't be here today. Hello? Yeah, there we go. At this very minute, Tom is at the Old Ambassador East Hotel in Chicago dedicating a plaque to Frank Sinatra, which was his colleague for many, many years. Tom was his opening act. He now does a one-person show concert as Frank Sinatra. So he couldn't be with us, but he sent us a video to tell us about his colony of Illinois expatriates in Hollywood, which is called Windy City West. Very interesting organization of Chicago, all right, Chicago-based actors. And the third guy is me. I'm a former state senator from Illinois. I'd like to tell you about 4 colonies of Illinois expatriates in particular. Terry is the president of the Illinois State Society of Washington, D.C., which is probably one of the most interesting Illinois clubs that you've never heard of. It was founded in 1854 as the Illinois Democratic Club of Washington City under Franklin Pierce when Abraham Lincoln came in March of 1861. Suddenly, overnight, they changed the name to the Illinois Republican Club of Washington City, and they kept changing back and forth over the years, and finally things settled down under President Wilson in the First World War. All the state clubs of Washington became nonpartisan state societies, and that tradition continues to the very present time. And Terry will tell you about some of our current activities and what we'll be doing in October. I'd also like to talk about the Illinois State Society of New York, which was very active from about 1899 to about the stock market crash in 1929. It didn't survive much longer than that. Then we have the Illinois State Society of San Diego, which was a group I'd never heard of. I stumbled across it in the archives of the San Diego Union newspaper, and a very large group. They would have thousands of people come and celebrate Lincoln's birthday and have a 4th of July picnic. And they were all people from Illinois who happened to settle in the greater San Diego area. The last group is Windy City West, and you'll hear more about that from Tom Dreesen in his video. This is Edward Albert, the Prince of Wales, who was our first big international visitor to Chicago in 1860. Mayor Long John Wentworth went to the balcony of the Tremont House Hotel and addressed the crowd below, said, "Boys, this is the prince. Prince, these are the boys." And that was about as much protocol as John Wentworth could muster at the time. This is Congressman Elihu Benjamin Washburn from Galena, who was a friend of President Grant. President Grant appointed him as the ambassador to France during the Franco-Prussian War. And he gained for the United States many, many friends because there was so much chaos going on in Paris at the time that he decided he would use his office to protect the diplomats of all other countries. They gathered at the American embassy and were able to survive the turmoil and the chaos of the Franco-Prussian War. A lot of you know Mary Harris by her more famous name, Mother Jones, also called the miner's angel, also called by other things. She had a tragic life in that she lost her husband and 4 children to yellow fever in 1867, and then at the time of the Chicago fire in 1871, she lost her dress shop and everything she owned in the Chicago fire. So she spent the rest of her life as a organizer for the Knights of Labor and the United Mine Workers. And a West Virginia prosecutor once called her the most dangerous woman in America because of her work with the miners. Mary Harris, Mother Jones, said, I'm not a humanitarian. They called her a humanitarian. She said, I'm not a humanitarian. I'm a hellraiser, and I love being a hellraiser. So she is buried at the Union Cemetery in southern Illinois, along with mine workers who had lost their lives during a coal strike. I think it was in, somebody might know this better than I do. If you know it, shout it out. All right, thank you. This is Dr. Benjamin Stevenson, who was from Decatur. He was the founder of the Grand Army of the Republic in 1867. And of course, there was at one time about 30% of all Union veterans belonged to the Grand Army of the Republic at its peak, sort of the American Legion of its day, the VFW of its day. And he was, before he organized this in 1866, and then in 1868, General John A. Logan from Murfreesboro became the national commander of the GAR, and he issued a General Order number 11, which created Memorial Day. And apparently Mrs. Logan had sort of gotten the idea from the Confederate ladies who were decorating the graves of Confederate veterans. So they founded Memorial Day in the North. When I was a child, my grandmother still called it Decoration Day. I don't know whether you remember that, but so every year the Illinois State Society goes to Logan's tomb, which is located on the Old Soldiers and Sailors Home in Washington, D.C. We present a wreath. We present a wreath also at the Lincoln Memorial every year on his birthday. These were the GAR unit in Yorkville, Illinois, around 1915. So they were active for a very long time. They had a relationship with the Republican Party of that time, somewhat similar to the relationship of organized labor to the Democratic Party in the 1950s. In other words, it was a very close alliance, and the sons of I'm trying to remember what the Confederate comparison organization was called. They had that same relation with the Democratic Party. President Grant was honored by the Illinois State Society on January the 6th, 1871, at the start of his, I guess it would be his second term, or maybe in the middle, and he was very gracious in his relationships with the Illinois State Society of Washington, D.C. This is Frances Willard, who was the first woman to be installed in Statuary Hall in the National Capitol, and she was at the College for Ladies in Northwestern University in Evanston, and the founder, I think she was both the founder and president of the, the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union. A lot of people don't know the Wild West background of Illinois. Wyatt Earp was from Monmouth, and he was too young to serve, or just barely too young to serve in the Civil War. His older brothers were in the Union Army, and just at the time when he would have been eligible for military service in 1864, his father decided to move the family to California. So he escaped military service with the Union Army, but of course he became one of the most famous lawmen of the West, and also late in his life he became an advisor to filmmakers in Hollywood on how they should make Westerns. This is Eugene Field, who worked for the Chicago Daily News. He was called the children's poet. One of his most famous ones was Wink and Blink and a Nod, and he also wrote Little Boy Blue, I think it was. Again, somebody not from Illinois originally, but came to settle in Chicago and had a big, profound impact beyond the borders of Illinois. Jane Addams was from Cedarville, graduated from Rockford College in 1882. Took a trip to, her father was a state senator, a Republican who was a friend of Abraham Lincoln, and she went to London to see the Toynbee Foundation, Toynbee Settlement House, and decided to try to copy that model with Hull House in Chicago at Polk and Halstead. And at its peak, the Hull House was doing some miraculous educational programs. Benny Goodman learned to play his clarinet at Hull House. Jimmy Petrillo, the head of the Musicians Union, learned to play the trumpet at Hull House, and he decided he was no good as a trumpet player, so he would become a Musicians Union head. This is my favorite quote from John D. Rockefeller about William Rainey Harper when he was the first president of the University of Chicago. I gave him an unlimited budget, and he exceeded it. And somebody recently on the faculty there told me nothing has changed since William Rainey Harper's time. These are the Stevensons. Vice President Stevenson on the left, who served under Grover Cleveland in his second term. Governor Adlai Stevenson at top. Below, you see Louis Stevenson, who was Secretary of State of Illinois during the First World War, and Senator Adlai Stevenson III, who was an advisor to the Illinois Channel, by the way, who is still around, and my friend on Facebook. And below right, you see, what happened? I don't know why my sound is cutting out. Below right is McLean Stevenson, who was from Bloomington. He played the role of Colonel Henry Blake on MASH. And one night he was on the Johnny Carson show, and Johnny said, I know you're from Bloomington. Tell me, how are you related to Senator Adlai E. Stevenson III? And McLean said, well, right now, I'm his cousin, but if he ever gets elected president, I'm going to be his brother. This is Carter Harrison, who was killed just after the end of the Chicago World's Fair of the Columbian Exposition, and he was killed by Eugene Prendergast, who was defended by Clarence Darrow. But in those days, justice was swift. I mean, he was tried, executed within a matter of weeks after the murder, and Clarence Darrow went on, of course, to be the most famous defense attorney in Illinois for many, many decades after that. This is Casey Jones, who wasn't born in Illinois, but he was an engineer for the Illinois Central Railroad. He got his first job running a shuttle at the Columbian Exposition from Van Buren Street to the fairgrounds in Jackson Park. On April the 1st, 1900, he was coming around a bend running in the Cannonball Run from Chicago to New Orleans, and they ran into another train on the track ahead of them. He was doing 75 miles an hour, and his fireman, Simeon Webb, said, there's something on the main line, Casey, and he said, jump, Sim, jump, and Sim jumped, and Casey by himself was able to slow the train to about 35 miles an hour, but it was still too late, and the train crashed into to the train ahead, and Simeon Webb, who was his African-American fireman on the train, wrote a ballad called the Ballad of Casey Jones that became famous and made him a popular legend. This is Frank Baum, who worked for a Chicago newspaper, and his book, The Wizard of Oz, and other books, Mother Goose in Prose, and he became probably the most famous author, not only because of the Oz books, which were all published in Chicago, and then he moved to Hollywood eventually late in his life. But the movie, The Wizard of Oz, continues to be one of the all-time favorites for most kids who've seen it. Joseph Ralph is probably nobody knows. He was from Joliet. He was the supervisor of construction at Ellis Island just before it opened in 1892. He was also director of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and he was secretary of our group, the Illinois State Society. So at one time or another, I think the statistic is something like 1 in 6 Americans have somebody in their ancestry who came through Ellis Island between 1892 and the time that it closed in 1954. This is Oscar Ricketts, who was from Ashmore in Coles County, a newspaper publisher over there. He was an ally of Speaker Joe Cannon around the turn of the century. He was president of our Illinois State Society of Washington, but he ran into trouble when Joe Cannon and Teddy Roosevelt got into this terrible feud, and the feud was this. Joe Cannon told a reporter for the Washington Post, Teddy Roosevelt has no more use for the Constitution than a tomcat has for a marriage license. So Teddy got mad and decided to punish Oscar Ricketts, who had nothing to do with it, but he just happened to be, Joe Cannon happened to be his sponsor. Joe was from Danville and, of course, was autocratic. This is an interesting man, the founder of the Chicago Daily News. It's the first penny newspaper in America. Melville Stone moved to New York, where he became general manager of a reorganized Associated Press, and he was the first president of the Illinois State Society of New York in about 1900. His son died on the Lusitania when a German U-boat sunk that boat in 1915. Judge Elbert Gary, was the first mayor of Wheaton, Illinois, and a DuPage County judge. He got interested in hearing a case about steel making, so he decided to go into the steel business himself and formed Federal Steel and Copper Wire Company, and eventually, with the help of Andrew Carnegie and some others, founded U.S. Steel in 1900. And it was funny, Teddy Roosevelt called him head of the Steel Trust, and he did not take this as an insult. He thought it was a nice thing that Teddy, but for the rest of his life, and this was true, very commonly true of men during the 19th century, they had their title used. Let's say you were a captain during the Civil War, and 40 years later you're still working for the Department of Agriculture in Washington. They still called you Captain Jones or Captain Smith as a courtesy title. All of his life, even though he was only a DuPage County judge, when he had been head of U.S. Steel for 25 years, Teddy Roosevelt and other people still called him Judge Gary. That was just his title. The Illinois State Society of New York was a very interesting group. Treasury Secretary Lyman Gage, who had been the first president of the First National Bank of Chicago, was the principal mover behind the Gold Standard Act of 1900, and it was Lyman Gage was the villain that William Jennings Bryan was talking about. William Jennings Bryan, also a native of Illinois, grew up here, went to college here, went to law school here. When William Jennings Bryan made his Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic Convention, he was referring directly to Lyman Gage for backing gold. Another person, this is the old Waldorf Astoria in New York, where they used to hold their annual Lincoln Day dinner, and they would have a lunch called Chicago Day to honor the anniversary of the Chicago fire on October 6th every year at Delmonico's. Now, Delmonico's looks exactly the same now as it did 150 years ago when they had their lunches there. Lyman Gage, I've already talked about. He was the Secretary of the Treasury under McKinley. And then this is Ida Tarbell. Doris Kearns Goodwin talks about her quite a bit in her book about Team of Rivals. She was a Lincoln biographer and a muckraker, and she was also a guest of the Illinois State Society. She wasn't from Illinois, but she was, because of her Lincoln scholarship, they often had her at the head table of the Illinois State Society. This is Dr. Julia Holmes, who was an early suffragist and led the Illinois delegation to the Women's March on Washington in March of 1913. There were a lot of women first, many women first in Illinois. Julia Lathrop was a member of the board of the Illinois State Society. She was director of the Children's Labor Bureau under both Taft and Wilson, and she was a vice president of the Illinois State Society. This is Louis F. Post, who was, his friends made fun of him because they said he looked like Leon Trotsky, and I think he does look like Trotsky a little bit. He was the Assistant Secretary of Labor under Wilson and Vice President of the Illinois State Society. He was a disciple of Henry George, and among the odd things he worked on was the language of Esperanto. He thought this would be a way to gain world peace, but it failed. And then Elbert Hubbard, who was a relative of L. Ron Hubbard, who was the founder of Scientology. Elbert wrote a very famous essay, a message to Garcia about a emissary from President McKinley to the leader of the rebels in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, and it has been one of the most translated and published essays of all time into 37 languages. Most of you know the story about Shoeless Joe Jackson and his colleagues who were barred from baseball, not by the Cook County courts, but by the first commissioner of baseball, who is this man, Judge Kenesaw Mountain Landis. Landis started his career as a brakeman on the Vandalia and Southern Railroad. He was the judge who presided over the trial of the defendants in the Eastland disaster. We were talking on the way in about the Eastland tour boat was going to take over 1,000 employees of Western Electric Hawthorne Works from Chicago to Michigan City, Indiana for a company picnic. And George Halas, the founder of the Chicago Bears and National Football League, was one of those employees. He was racing to get on the boat before it left, but he got as far as the Clark Street Bridge. He was late, and he saw the Eastland roll over on its side, killing about 880 people. It was a horrible, horrible disaster. And just recently, some of you from the Chicago area might know, they had the 100th anniversary of the Eastland disaster. Of an obscure archive in Germany found motion picture video of the rescue workers working on the Eastland just after the disaster. What had happened, because of the Titanic, the Federal Maritime Commission sent out new rules that you had to add more lifeboats. Well, the Eastland was already top heavy and already unstable, and when they added more heavy lifeboats on the top of the boat, it just made it so unstable that all it took was about 100 people to rush to one side of the boat to see something that was going on in the water, and then it rolled over on its side, and it was the worst maritime disaster in Chicago history. We were when we passed the state fairgrounds on the way in, I was telling someone that, I was telling Terry that during the First World War, the state fairgrounds were known as Camp Loudon, because that's where the Illinois National Guard was mobilized to go to Europe and fight in the First World War. He was one of the most interesting and respected governors in Illinois history, in my view anyway. He was married to George Pullman's daughter, and when he was nominated for president in 1920, he and Leonard Wood from Missouri were in a deadlock, and the party bosses got together and decided to go for this obscure senator from Ohio, Warren Harding. And in the infamous smoke-filled room at the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago, to this very day, there is a plaque on that room on the second floor of the Blackstone Hotel that shows where the smoke-filled room happened and where the power brokers of the Republican Party decided to nominate Warren Harding, who of course turned out to be not such a great president. This woman's picture is here because she didn't leave Illinois, but I knew her personally. She was a friend of my mother's, Lottie Holman ONeill from Downers Grove. I forget the little town she was born in. Lottie was the first woman to be elected to the Illinois House of Representatives in 1922. She was elected to the State Senate in 1950, and there was no facility for women in the State Senate. So the janitors jerry-rigged a water pipe and some other things to a special little closet. Within an hour, the male senators were calling it Lottie's potty, and there is now a bronze statue to Lottie in the rotunda if you go there. But when my mother asked Lottie before she died, would you like a statue to you in the Capitol to commemorate the fact that you were the first woman member of the General Assembly. And she said, oh God, Mary, no. And my mom said, well, why not? She said, because I don't want to face that son of a bitch, Bill Barr, for all eternity across the rotunda. Bill Barr from Joliet was her enemy, political adversary. And where have they got the statue? Facing Bill Barr, right there. And I'm one of the few people who probably knows that story, but I'll tell it to the guides someday. This is Herbert Rutledge, who was the president of the Illinois State Society 1919 to 1923. I've talked to his family, and they claim that he was related to Anne Rutledge, even though she was in New Salem and he was from Alton. He came to Illinois to work for the Bureau of Crop Livestock Estimates and really got the entire state society movement on its way, not just Illinois, but a bunch of other state societies. Vachel Lindsay, all of you from Springfield know about, and he got his start really reciting for President Wilson about the founder of the Salvation Army, General William Booth. This is Agnes Ayres from Carbondale. She was a leading lady of the silent era. This is her famous love scene with Rudolph Valentino in a movie called The Sheik. And again, lots of people in Carbondale don't know about Alice Ayres. Bessie Coleman was born in Texas but moved to Chicago in about 1915 or 16. And she had an admiration for the pilots coming back from World War I. And she said, you know, I'd like to be a pilot. Never even thinking, never even entered her head that maybe an African-American woman would have a tough time becoming a pilot. So the publisher of the Chicago Defender said, you ought to go to Paris because they're much more open and liberal in their thinking. You can get flying lessons there. So she did. She went to Paris and then came back to Chicago, decided she would like to try to get advanced lessons. There was still no place in Chicago she could find lessons. So she went back to Paris a second time, got accredited as the first international, not only the first woman, but the first American period of either race or gender to get an international pilot license to fly. And this is about 10 years before Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart became famous as white aviators. And Bessie Coleman was an inspiration to other people, and I'll talk about that in a minute. This is Billy Sunday. I've heard in the song since I was a kid, the town that Billy Sunday could not shut down, but I didn't really know who he was. He was an evangelist. He started his life playing as an outfielder for the Chicago White Stockings. Now, if you know Chicago baseball history, the White Stockings are not the White Sox. The White Stockings were a different team that actually became the Chicago Cubs later on. And the White Sox moved from Iowa, where they were a minor league team. When he was a player for the White Stockings, he decided to turn away from Demon Rum, and he went to the Pacific Garden Mission in Chicago and decided to dedicate his life to Christian evangelism. And this was in a time when before he spoke to thousands of people in Decatur and Peoria. Before there were sound systems, he just had to belt it out or use a megaphone or something like that. This is John Gruhl from Arcola in Douglas County. He was the creator of Raggedy Ann and Andy. So he had an impact on culture beyond the borders of Illinois. This is President Taft when he was not president, when he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and President Harding in the middle, and Robert Todd Lincoln on the right when they dedicated the Lincoln Memorial in Washington in 1925. Again, Robert Todd Lincoln probably doesn't get his story told the way it should be told. A very interesting man. Again, he was involved in the railroad business and an outstanding businessman in his own right. His son, Abraham Lincoln II, his nickname was Jack Lincoln. Jack came to Lincoln Park in Chicago to dedicate the Augustus St. Gaudens statue of the standing Lincoln. And my family grew up in the area of Lincoln Park. I used to love that statue. And you can imagine my surprise when I was at Westminster Abbey in London a few years ago, and I saw the exact same duplicate statue at a church right across the street from Westminster Abbey, at an Episcopal church, and it's identical because they made it from the same mold. The family of Augustus St. Gaudens gave their permission to have a wonderful, and just another illustration of the impact of Lincoln. When we've talked about Jimmy Petrillo as head of the Musicians Union, Chicago and Illinois more broadly has been a great state for musicians of all kinds. Louis Armstrong lived there in the 1920s, and he married his wife, Lil Hardin, who they lived there until about 1930. This is another first for women. Winifred Mason Huck, or Winifred Sprague Mason Huck, was the daughter of Senator Mason from Illinois. When he died, he was back in the House, and a special election was held in 1923 to fill the seat of her father. So that way she became the first woman member of Congress from Illinois. Her niece is still living and came to one of our Illinois State Society events back a few years ago. She is Jimmy Lou Mason, who is a world-famous sculptor and has done all kinds of fascinating sculptures all over the world, one of Audie Murphy in Texas and others that you have seen. This, of course, is Louis Sullivan. Most of you know his influence on architecture and the Prairie School movement. Again, we have Clarence Darrow defending Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb in their famous and infamous trial for the murder of Bobby Franks in 1924. Leopold and Loeb were two very smart University of Chicago graduates who wanted to, or not graduates, but students wanted to commit the perfect crime. They were young. They were only 17 or 18 years old. I think Bobby Franks was about 12 or 13. They broke the case by being able to identify some special prescription glasses that Bobby Franks had worn. And Clarence Darrow tried to make the whole trial about the death penalty. Maybe I can get them off. So he forewent a jury trial and just had the judge rule on the case, and the judge decided to sentence them to life. But while Nathan Leopold lived out his life in prison, Richard Loeb was killed in a prison riot. And when Nathan Leopold became a friend of my mother's friend, Gladys Erickson, who was a reporter for the Chicago American, Herald American at the time, Gladys went to Joliet Prison to do a story about prisoners who had volunteered to make themselves guinea pigs for a anti-malaria vaccine. And in the course of that, she walked up to Nathan Leopold, not knowing who he was, because it had been 30 years since his famous trial. She said, "Would you talk to me? I'm a reporter for the Chicago American." And he just coldly turned on and walked away from her. He said, "Apparently you don't know my rule." So Gladys went to the guard and said, "Who's that guy?" And he said, "Well, that's Nathan Leopold." So anyway, 2 days later, she got a letter from Nathan Leopold at her newspaper office. And the letter said, "Dear Mrs. Erickson, I did not realize that you wanted to talk to me about the malaria experiments. I naturally assumed that you wanted to talk to me about my trial. But if you would like to confine the interview just to the topic of the malaria experiments, I'd be happy to talk to you." So she went back to Joliet, talked to him, got an exclusive interview, and over the next few years, built up a trust factor. And finally, by the time that Leopold was ready to be sort of semi-pardoned to live out his life in Puerto Rico, he gave her the exclusive interview when he got out of prison. Here again, two Illinois-educated lawyers, Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan, faced off against each other at the Scopes Monkey trial in 1925 when Darrow defended a teacher who was teaching something about evolution that was not approved by the state of Tennessee. This is Charles Dawes. It amazes me how often people forget who Charles Dawes was. He was vice president under Calvin Coolidge. won the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1925 for work he had done on stabilizing the currencies of Europe after the First World War. Quite interesting to me was the fact that he was also a great-grandson of William Dawes, who rode with Paul Revere on the first night of the Lexington alarm on April the 8th, 1775. His brother was Rufus Dawes, who was head of the Chicago World's Fair. He had another brother, William Dawes, who was head of the Chicago Chamber of Commerce. And he was also, William Dawes was a member of the Secret Six. Does anyone recognize the Secret Six? The Secret Six was a group of business leaders in Chicago headed by Samuel Insull, the head of the Sears Roebuck, Julius Rosenwald, whole bunch of distinguished business leaders. They decided after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre that their investment in the World's Fair of 1933 would be in big trouble if people were too afraid to bring their families and their children to Chicago for the World's Fair. So they decided on their own to create a private war against Al Capone. They would work with the government. They hired Alexander Jamie, who was the, excuse me, I went too far. Alexander Jamie was the brother-in-law of Eliot Ness, who worked for the Bureau of Investigation, which later became the FBI. In those days, apparently it was possible, or at least they did it. Jamie served on 2 different payrolls. He was on the government payroll, but he was also on a private payroll of the Secret Six to turn up evidence against Al Capone. And finally, a former Illinois governor, Green, what was Governor Green's? Pete Green was his nickname, but I can't remember his actual first. Dwight Green was the prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney's Office who prosecuted Al Capone. Thank you. I said shout out if you know the answer. But anyway, it was very creative use. For the first time, they were able to get Capone on, not on the murders he had done, not on the violent crimes he had done, but on income tax evasion. This is the brother of William Jennings Bryan, younger brother, also from Salem, Illinois, became governor of Nebraska, and then later he was a candidate for vice president on one of the Democratic tickets in the 1940s. Here's Coolidge and Dawes again, who they had a little bit of a frosty relationship, in my view, because Coolidge might have been just a little bit jealous of William Dawes because of his international reputation and the fact that he had won the Nobel Prize and so forth. He shared the Nobel Prize with Sir Austen Chamberlain of England. You all know the crime history of Chicago, starting with Dean O'Banion's. Now, this gentleman is from Beardstown. Anybody here from Beardstown or nearby? He also was a silent film star. Eddie Lyons, who starred in 369 films. He was a writer and a producer. The most famous person in Illinois in 1925 was not a business person, not a politician, not a gangster. It was Red Grange, who was from Wheaton, Illinois. He was known as the Galloping Ghost and the Wheaton Iceman. He had played, his father was the constable of Wheaton. He had played high school football for Wheaton. Then when he became varsity halfback at the University of Illinois, he just became nationally and even internationally famous. And George Halas had hired him to play for the Chicago Bears, and really had a lot to do with setting the Bears on their feet. The Bears had been playing in Decatur, where they were known as the Decatur Staleys. And the one story I love about George Halas, it was about 1976 or something like that, and a reporter who now works for ESPN was working for the Sporting News. He got his first big exclusive to interview George Halas. So he said, "Mr. Halas, who's the greatest running back you ever saw?" Halas says, "Got to be Red Grange." And he said, "Well, if Red Grange were playing today, how many yards do you think he'd rush for?" Halas said, "Oh, about 700. And the reporter said, 700? That's just okay. And the guy said, Halas said, "Son, you got to realize something. Red Grange is 75 years old." So this is Frank Reid from Aurora. His daughter-in-law, Charlotte Reid, was in Congress in the 1970s. He was the civilian defense counsel for General Billy Mitchell during the other big famous trial of the 1920s, the court-martial of Billy Mitchell. Ironically, in the movie they made about the court-martial that starred Gary Cooper as Billy Mitchell, Frank Reid was played by Ralph Bellamy, who was also a Chicago actor who grew up in Chicago. Senator William McKinley was from Petersburg, but he was no relation to the president, no relation to that family at all. This was Congressman, oh, I'm sorry, this is somebody else. This is Hinky Dink Kenna and Bathhouse John Coughlin. My mother knew Bathhouse John. She didn't know him, but she used to have to deliver the papers to his office. And she said he was the power broker of the First Ward in Chicago with tobacco spittle all up and down his shirt front. Apparently was a disgusting person to meet in person. This is the boxer Jack Johnson, who was lived part of the time in Joliet and bought his mother a house in Chicago. This is Charles Dewey, who was a congressman from Illinois and the cousin of New York Governor Thomas Dewey, who ran for president in 1948. And Dewey was a very important figure because he was U.S. delegate to the Bretton Woods Conference on monetary exchange rates in 1944. And one time, it was John Maynard Keynes from England was very anxious to find out what Congressman Dewey was thinking about the agreement they wanted to sign on currencies, because he just assumed that Congressman Dewey was speaking for his cousin, Governor Thomas E. Dewey. They never talked about it. So this is Lois DeLander from Joliet, who was the first Miss America back in 1927. If you're from Southern Illinois, Oscar Mieshaw was sort of the Spike Lee of his generation. He was the first African-American film producer of silent films and later of sound films. He's viewed by the Motion Picture Producers Association as one of the most prolific film writers and producers of the 20th century. And again, somebody his story needs to be more told, I think. William Borah was born in Illinois, Fairfield, but he went on to Idaho, where he became a famous senator. He was profiled by Jack Kennedy in Profiles in Courage. And Marshall Field III served in the same National Guard unit as Mr. McCormick, the head of the Chicago Tribune. The career of Charles Lindbergh in Illinois is often overlooked. He was from Minnesota. His father was a congressman from Minnesota, but he was hired by the Chicago Daily News to fly down to Murfreesboro to get some exclusive negatives of tornado damage there in 1925. And a reporter from the Hearst newspapers played a dirty trick on him, found out that Lindy was coming in, and he gave him some blank plates in order to prevent the Tribune from getting a scoop. And this dirty trick was so hated by Lindbergh, he wasn't even paid by the Tribune for his gas to fly down to Murfreesboro, and he just hated reporters ever after that. This was a long time before, of course, his child was kidnapped in New Jersey by Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Lindbergh flew from Maywood to Peoria to Springfield to St. Louis and back again every week on his mail route, and he hired some of his former Army Air Force buddies or Army Air Corps buddies to fly the contract mail routes with him. However, what happened was that in the fall of 1926, he started to run into some bad weather. He went down over Bloomington one time and went down over Ottawa another time. He was in a crash near the Charles Thompson farm in Ottawa, and then another crash. He had to jump out, and the plane went down on a farm near Bloomington. So the Minister of Aviation at that time was from Illinois, a former Attorney General by the name of William McCracken. McCracken was hired by Herbert Hoover when Herbert Hoover was Secretary of Secretary of Commerce, thank you, to be the first, like a one-person FAA. And he was so worried about how reckless he thought Lindbergh was that he was going to take his pilot's license away from him. The people at Ryan Aircraft in St. Louis went begging, hat in hand, begging to McCracken and said, please don't take his license away from him because he's going to try for the Yortig Prize, which is $25,000 for flying solo across the Atlantic Ocean, or flying across the Atlantic Ocean solo or otherwise. So McCracken said, as of today, he stops flying the mail in Illinois. You can prepare for your trip. And once he's out of the ocean, he's not my responsibility anymore. You can do what you want to with him. But he and McCracken, that's McCracken in the background with Lindbergh, finally did become friends, and they both became great advocates for aviation safety. I mentioned Vice President Dawes. That's William Dawes on the left, who was head of the Commerce and Industry, Lindbergh in the middle, and Mayor Big Bill Thompson. This was at Soldier Field when they had a welcome home rally for Lindbergh after his trip. And when I was a kid, we could see the beacon on top of the Palmolive building in Chicago. It's still there, but it's surrounded by taller buildings, so you can no longer see a 360-yard sweep of the beacon from St. Louis to Cleveland because they're limited to about, I don't know, 20 degrees or something so that they won't hit the surrounding buildings. This was the famous Dempsey-Tunney fight of 1927 that was at Soldiers Field in Chicago. And if you've heard of the long count of the Dempsey-Tunney fight, what they're talking about was that Jack Dempsey got knocked down and he didn't, or excuse me, Tunney got knocked down. Dempsey did not go to a neutral corner, and that gave Tunney more time to recover and eventually came back to win the fight. This is Congressman Henry Riggs Rathbone from Chicago. He was our president of the Illinois State Society in 1928. His parents were Clara Harris, the daughter of Senator Ira Harris of New York, and Major Henry Rathbone. They were an engaged couple who were invited to sit in the box with President and Mrs. Lincoln on the night of April 14th, 1865, to see the last performance of Our American Cousin with Laura Keene at Ford's Theater. And John Wilkes Booth came into the back of the box, shot Lincoln with a Derringer. Then he went over to the side of the box where Major Rathbone and his fiancée were sitting. He got into a tussle with Major Rathbone, pulled out a knife and cut the arm of Major Rathbone and jumped 11 feet to the box below, shouting "Sic Semper Tyrannis." What a lot of people don't know is the rest of Rathbone's life was very tragic. He was serving as an ambassador to Germany in the 1870s, and I think a combination of his struggle with Booth, he blamed himself for that. No reason he should have blamed himself for that, because he didn't know what Booth was going to do. And his trauma from his battles during the Civil War, he lost his mind. He went up a couple of days before Christmas, found his wife Clara and murdered her, and he went looking for the two children and couldn't find them, so he wasn't able to harm them that day. And then he lived out the rest of his life in an asylum for the criminally insane, died there in 1911. But Congressman Rathbone, who's pictured here, went on to lead a very distinguished career in the law and representing Illinois in Congress and as our president. Here's Charles Dawes again. This is Gloria Swanson. I probably should break it up here. Can you come up and show? Tom Dreesen couldn't be here with us today because he's up in Chicago right at this minute dedicating a plaque to Frank Sinatra at the Ambassador East Hotel. But Tom sent us a video to explain his angle of this story about the exile colony in Hollywood called Windy City West. So let's hear what Tom has to say.
Hi, I'm Dreesen. I'm a stand-up comedian. This is my 47th year in show business. And my first 7 years started out in Chicago. I came out here in 1975, moved out here because as a stand-up comedian, you had to get on the Tonight Show in order to advance your career, and that's what I did. So I've been out here over 40 years, and hardly a day goes by that I don't miss Chicago. I feel, as most Chicagoans feel, it's the greatest city in the United States, and for good reasons. It's a great walking city. It's the beauty of the lake, the culture, the art institutes, the Frank Lloyd Wright influence on architecture, the sports. What a great sports town it is, with 2 Major League Baseball teams among Chicago Bulls, Chicago Blackhawks, and of course Chicago Fire, and it's just a great sports town. Restaurants can compete with any city in America, but the bottom line are the people. The people are the friendliest people in the United States, and that's what we miss the most when we come out here to the West Coast. And we're always trying to find reasons to get together. Chicagoans love to hang out. That's our favorite pastime, hanging out. And 1987, I'm going to refer to my notes if you don't mind, but in 1987, Chicagoans Ginny Weissman, who's a former TV Week editor at the Chicago Tribune, and Morgan Moore was a film publicist for John Iltis and Associates. They were living in Hollywood and working in the film and TV industry. They wanted to see their Chicago friends. And they knew there were many out here working in Hollywood, but there's no place to hang out here, no bar like Ricardo's or the Billy Goat Tavern in Chicago where everybody hung out. You know. Ginny and Morgan planned to have a cookout in Morgan's backyard to get everyone together. They started inviting friends, and one of the friends they invited was a girl named Trish Alexander, who's no longer here. She contacted me, and I went to this cookout, and they started talking about bringing Chicagoans together. And I suggested, why don't we talk to my friend Richie Melman. Richie Melman, who most of you know is one of the most successful restaurateurs in the world. He's probably managed 400 or 500 restaurants, not only in Chicago, but in Las Vegas and out here, of course, in the West Coast and all over the world for that matter. Well, we went over, Richie had a place here in Hollywood called Ed DeBevick's. So all 4 of us went over there, Trish Alexander, Ginny Weissman, Morgan Moore, and myself went over to Ed DeBevick's, and we met with Richie Melman and told him our idea for bringing Chicagoans together. We wanted to call it Windy City West. Richie said, fantastic idea. He said, I'll fly in Chicago food, deep dish pizza, beef sandwiches, hot dogs, Berghoff beer, Frango mince, Eli's cheesecake. It doesn't get any more Chicago than that. So the Windy City West founding committee was Ginny Weissman, Morgan Moore, Tom Dreesen, Linda Mancuso, Trish Alexander, Jeff Gordon, Karen Schiffman, and Kevin Galocoli. We formed this committee and started working on this project. The first party was held at Ed DeBevick's out here in Hollywood in 1987. 250 Chicago expatriates attended from the film and TV industry and from the recording industry as well. Alums of Second City, Northwestern University, the Goodman Theater, and Steppenwolf Theater were among the guests. I was the master of ceremonies and the host. The second year, nearly 1,000 people turned out. A tent was added to the parking lot of the restaurant, and the lines went around the blocks. We actually stopped traffic. We didn't realize that many people would come out. The parties continued for 10 consecutive years at Ed DeBevick's. The Windy City West Award was something we came up with. Let's give this to a current Chicagoan or a former Chicagoan that was living out here. So it was presented to honorees like Steve Allen, Brandon Tartikoff, Mike Ditka, Fred Silverman, Lee Phillip and Bill Bell, Marley Matlin, and Chicago Cubs owner Tom Ricketts, just to name a few. In 1990, Ginny Weissman produced a 1-hour special on Windy City West that was broadcast on WMAQ TV, Channel 5 in Chicago. In 1996, after all these years, the Windy City West Party went on hiatus because most of us were working in the industry and 3 of the committee members had passed away. So we let it go on hiatus for a couple of years, and then Brenda Sexton, who was the head of the, under the Illinois Film Commissioner, she was the Illinois Film Commissioner, Brenda Sexton. She revived it a few years later with a couple of parties at Universal City. In 2009, Ginny Weissman and Brenda approached Rich Melman again about hosting the Windy City West Party. He agreed, and the party was held at his new West Coast restaurant, La Grande Orange in Santa Monica, and again, flying in Chicago favorites like Lou Malnati's Pizza and Deep Dish Pizza and Portello's beef sandwiches and hot dogs. In 2012, Windy City West celebrated its 25th anniversary at Let Us Entertain You's newest West Coast restaurant, the M Street Cafe and Stella Rosa Pizza Bar in Santa Monica. Once again, Let Us Entertain You flew in Chicago food favorites for an evening of culinary camaraderie. Over the years, the celebrity guests have been just enormous. I'll try to name some of them here, but I know I'm going to leave some out. But We had people like Jim Belushi, Marilou Henner, Gary Cole, Gary Sinise, Bonnie Hunt, Ernie Banks, Adrian Zebed, Mark DiCarlo, Bill Zwecker, Joe Mantegna, Chris O'Donnell, Jeff Garland, Nick Vardolis, Dick Butkus, Richard Kind, Amy Landecker, Chaz Ebert, Joel Murray, Billy Zane, Dennis Farina, James Denton, Shecky Green, Shelley Berman, Robert Conrad, Sherry Lansing, and William Friedkin, Mandy Patinkin, Mandy Patinkin, Harvey Korman, Ed Asner, Mary Fran, Lois Nettleton, Adrian Zemed, Artie Johnson, Marsha Warfield, Tom Irwin, Harry and Gay Blackstone, Ken Ehrlich, and so many more. You know, we're planning a 30th Windy City West party in the year 2017. It's just a great time for us to get together and exchange ideas and thoughts and just talk about how much we love Chicago. That's how Windy City West started, and I hope this satisfies what Mark was looking for. Mark, I'm sorry it took me so long to get back to you, but I hope this suffices.